coming along tonight. Thank you for everybody on Zoom. You're now being very successfully monitored, so people's chats, we can pick up everything that's going on. Thank you, that's so good. It's a great delight for us to have Dr. Annemieke Milks here, who's postdoctoral fellow at Reading University, really famous for her work on Middle Pleistocene weaponry, the wooden artifacts that are famously seen at Schöningen, including these amazing throwing sticks or potential throwing sticks. She's also, I mean, something that's particularly relevant for us is the interaction that Annemieke has put forward between archaeology and ethnography, really putting archaeology into ethnographic context. Tonight, she has placed us in a position of honor, calling us the Radical Archaeology Group for this seminar, which we're very happy about. And that's about the first time that's happened in our 40-odd years of history. But we're very honored for that. So even though Annemiek's specialism is particularly Pleistocene weaponry, and we do hope to hear about that, the focus tonight is the archaeology of children, which she's done a lot of work with beautiful articles. And tonight, talking about hunting lessons, how forager children going to visit Children of the Day, Bayaka, who of course our colleague Jerome Lewis probably knows very well, and working out, learning from them how they learn to hunt. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Camilla. It's really great to be here. And yes, I did notice just before I came that in my pre-coffee state this morning, I called this the Radical Archaeology Group. So, but it's an anthropology group, and it's really nice to kind of try and bring together some of the work on archaeology and ethnography that I've tried to do throughout my research story. And I think before I get started with the research itself, I just kind of want to tell you a little bit about my background, only because that is actually specifically what drove me both to look at ethnographic data when we look at the archaeological records, also to do a lot of the experimental archaeology work that I've done, and the curiosity that I've developed from studying weaponry to trying to think about children and skills and development of skills. So I came into archaeology fairly late. I used to be a professional musician, and I had to give it up because I had an accident. I was in the middle of a my third year of an orchestra job after my postgraduate studies. And I think I felt that if I needed to give up something that I'd done since I was 2, 3, 4 years old and worked extremely hard at and absolutely loved, that I needed to do something else that was going to be, interesting, curious, and would continue to bring passion. And it does still absolutely do that for me. I don't think I'd appreciated that I was also choosing a career that would be equally difficult to get and keep a job, have a good salary, whatever. But it's been a good choice, and I do actually love it. But as someone who'd spent maybe decades working from early childhood, working towards something that was very, very skill-based, not knowledge-based, but very skill-based and very physical. When I got into archaeology and started studying weaponry and the earliest use of weaponry, my sense was that there were quite a number of archaeologists and publications that were kind of dismissive of the skills, let's put it politely, and maybe a little bit overconfident in their own skills at picking up a weapon and throwing it or using it. And so this was something that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, partly because we had also a history of strike action in the US around orchestra pay and things like this. And usually when you'd have this kind of strike action, you get comments from the public around like, well, how hard can it be? What you do, it's like, it's really hard. So I think, well, I could do that, or I could pick up a violin and do that job. What's the big deal? And of course you can't. That's the whole point. Particularly with something like string instrument or piano, if you haven't started it in early childhood, middle childhood at the latest, it's too late. You can't pick it up in adolescence even. It's too late for you to develop the kind of motor skills and the physical skills to be able to be on par with the people who started when they were 3, 4, 5 years old. So I ended up here at UCL, which had this graduate diploma, which allowed me to kind of come into archaeology with no background, knowing nothing. I didn't know what Paleolithic was. I knew absolutely nothing. And then do a master's here as well in the archaeology and anthropology department. So I was in Paleolithic archaeology and paleoanthropology. And I wasn't completely sure, but by that point I knew I wanted to do human evolution, and then took a little bit of a break and then came back and did my PhD. So UCL is really my original home, and I absolutely loved my studies. And I did the PhD in particular, my master's dissertation had been in Gravettian Upper Paleolithic spears, which hadn't been really my concept at all. It was just kind of a dissertation topic that was handed to me, which I was very grateful for because I knew nothing, as I mentioned. So I ended up doing some experiments with that, and then that kind of led to the PhD, where I looked at these earliest weapons in the archaeological record. I'll show you a little bit about them today. You can grill me at the end if you want, because I'm not focusing so much on the use of those weapons and the woodworking studies that we've done, but I'm happy to answer questions. And yeah, as I said, as part of that, there was a bit of ethnographic kind of review of the use of earliest wooden spears, quite a lot of experimental archaeology where we worked with javelin athletes. I worked with military personnel to try and understand what skilled use of these earliest weapons looked like. So in the last couple of years, that's kind of led me in a new direction, which is partly a result of wanting to understand the development of skill, as I said, in learning to hunt. And there are some amazing, a whole array of amazing publications out there now. I point specifically to April Noel's new book on Ice Age, growing up in the Ice Age. Is fantastic. It's a really beautiful book. She really is the kind of the master of archaeology of Pliocene and Pleistocene childhood. But I've done this kind of light touch review, which was published last year as part of the Journal of Hunter-Gatherer Research, as part of a special collection that April herself was editor on. And that's basically what I'm going to go through, what some of the archaeological and ethnographic evidence is today. And that kind of also came out of a review that I did with some colleagues a few years ago on what is the archaeological evidence as a whole for hunter-gatherer children, specifically focusing on Homo sapiens. That happened to come out just before April's book, which I think does something sort of similarly, but in much greater depth. So I'm not going to get too deeply into what we mean by childhood and adolescence. The main thing to say, which most people cover in publications on archaeology of childhood, is that childhood and adolescence are incredibly variable socially, biologically, culturally. So there's no strict kind of age bracketing that we can do. I followed April Noel and Jenny French's kind of brackets here. And one of the interesting, so I think what's interesting now, where I'm kind of thinking about why do we want to bracket this, is because early childhood, say around 3 to 6 years, and adolescence seem to be periods of life history development which appear to be unique to Homo sapiens. So other mammals and primates will have these juvenile infancy and juvenile periods, what some people are calling maybe juvenile now rather than the middle childhood. But that early childhood and adolescence seem to be key for our species. So the question is that a lot of people are starting to look at and think about is not only why did those specific stages exist, but also when did in the Middle Pleistocene probably, and with which species of Homo did they first emerge? So, and then in terms of thinking about childhood and hunting, so we've, together with my colleague Shana Love-Levy, we've published a few papers now looking at the fact that hunting itself is a very complex skill. There's lots of kind of scaffolding that goes on. The Bayaka themselves, for example, as an example, will describe hunting as one of the most complex things that they do, whether that's just the men speaking, I'm not sure. But it is considered to be a skill that takes a long period of development to learn and does start in early childhood. The archaeological evidence is, I would say it's still relatively sparse. So I am going to go through what I think the archaeological evidence might be of learning how to hunt. But not everybody would agree that that archaeological evidence in each case would point to children or childhood. So there's still debates about what the archaeological evidence means. And I'm just going to take you across vast time and space in the talk. So all things considered, over hundreds of thousands of years, it is relatively sparse. So I'll kind of follow the headings of the paper itself broadly throughout, but I'm going to talk about the archaeology first. And then at the end, I'll kind of go through where I think ethnography helps us to kind of expand our thinking and tell new narratives, and explore what's possible and what's possible in the deep human past. So we can ask various questions of things like about children's hunting gear, their toys and their tools, debates that archaeologists would have around this include what does it mean to have something that's miniature? So the classic interpretation of miniatures might have been something symbolic, figurines, things like that, miniature projectile points. But in the last 20, 30 years, you've started to see some nice papers exploring whether or not those miniatures could have been toys or even functional hunting tools. And then what is the difference between a toy and a functional tool? It might not be a very clear category. So that's another thing that we tend to ask in the archaeological realm. And so to what extent also are there tools and toys, if they're functional tools in particular, are they scaled? Because maybe if we look at equipment scaling, we can see in the archaeological records something that might be a kid's object. And does engagement, so I also say at what age might they begin hunting and in what ways? And does that depend on the hunting technology? So does it depend if you're looking at spear use or spear thrower use or bow and arrows? Probably. And then what materials are used for the kids' hunting toys and tools? So I'll start with an obvious category of hunting kit for kids, which are miniature examples of miniature projectile points. There's actually some really, it's a nice range, particularly from the Americas. And these cases are actually all from the Americas, more or less. Not the Dorset cultures much, but when we are thinking about miniatures, there are various issues. As I mentioned, miniature projectile points could be functional adult tools that are equipped with tiny points for some reason, depending on the type of prey you might be hunting. They could be kids' tools. They could be a toy. They could have some other symbolic function. And it can be very difficult to tell the difference. So various arguments that have been used to argue for these being kids' culture are that you have things like abraded edges, which might make the projectile points less dangerous if a kid was using it. That's another area where I think is worth discussion. if it's a functional tool versus a toy, some papers have focused on the fact that you have kind of durable materials. And in some cases, like with these mini harpoon heads and the adolescent grips I'll show you in a moment, the materials themselves, if they're particularly hard to work and difficult to craft, might signify that these are functional tools rather than something that somebody invests a lot of time in making a toy for a child. Another way that we might kind of identify them as being kids' material culture is if they're very poorly made. And we think, well, that's not a particularly beautiful projectile point amongst an assemblage that has a lot of really nicely made projectile points that might signify kids learning how to make their own equipment and their own toys as well. Another area around the weaponry itself are these kinds of examples of miniature tools that might have been used to make weapons. So, for example, the bâtons percés. So not everybody agrees that bâtons percés from the Upper Paleolithic were used for arrow shaft or spear thrower shaft smoothing. There's also some really nice work that's been done by Sylvia Bello and Claire Lucas at the British Museum looking at these, saying actually they were probably tools for things like rope making and organics. We're not completely sure, but there's this beautiful example, I think, of this miniature bâton percé from Istritz compared with a normal size one. And so either way, we have this kind of miniature potentially shaft smooth tool. And here's another one, a small shaft smoother, which is from the same assemblage as these tiny projectile points here. And so Daw looks at those and says, you know, maybe we've got evidence here of kids' material culture. I think this is another fantastic paper that came out in 2019 by Losey and Hull, who were looking at scaled whalebone atlatl grips from the site. And as I mentioned, again, you've got a material here that is difficult to work, is durable, and a whole range of different sizes. And they looked at hand sizes, and although there is definitely the potential there that you've got hand atlatl grips that would fit female hands, there were enough within the assemblage that were probably too small even for adult female hands as to be kind of more associated maybe with younger hands. And where I think there's maybe quite a lot of room for archaeologists to explore here is around this equipment scaling in relation to things like hand size and grip strength of kids and adolescents. We really haven't done that kind of work in great detail yet. So here's my little specialty, as Camilla rightly pointed out. These are the spheres that I did my PhD on. They're also an earlier example from Clacton-on-Sea, which is broken from marine isotope stage 11. So Shining is an absolutely extraordinary site for anybody who doesn't know it, from marine isotope stage 9, about 300,000 years ago. And at this site, it was discovered in the 1980s. You have a whole range of wooden weapons, as well as now I think it's over 50 butchered horses and other butchered fauna, but primarily a focus on hunting horse in multiple seasons over a long period of time. This paleo lake that probably had lots of other attractions for subsistence, not just hunting. It probably had lots of very good plant food sources. There's a nice PhD and papers by Gerlinda Biga and Brigitte Urban, who explore the kind of non-animal sources that might have been available at the Paleo Lake. And amongst the spheres, you will see here in a paper that we published just this last year, you'll see a range of different sizes. Now, not all of these are complete. Some of them are a bit broken, but the spheres that you see here are mostly complete. We see all kinds of different things going on. So spear 10 was probably larger, longer initially, but it's been broken at the tip and recycled. But you nevertheless should be able to say that spear 6 is absolutely massive. It's I think it's over 2.5 meters long. Whereas spear 10 and spear 3 are much thinner and are much probably lighter weight weapons. Spear 2 is the one that I did almost all my experimental work with to keep things consistent because it's the sort of average length. Whether or not we can see kids hunting at Schöningen is something that I think is really difficult to say. But there is some other evidence at Schöningen that might point to that. But in addition to the very large 2.5 meter long spears, we also have now a category of other weapons, which is these throwing sticks. Also evidence at the site. This is an example of one of the throwing sticks that we analyzed in detail to kind of explore the woodworking processes. And that's exactly this one. So you can see that there's some quite small throwing sticks at the site as well. And again, even in the Middle Pleistocene, people would have needed to learn how to hunt. Now, whether or not they're engaging in hunting in the sort of, attacking a horse herd at a lakeshore site, which could have been potentially quite dangerous sort of scenario, is less clear, but throwing sticks are well known as weapons that are used by children. They can be used for hunting smaller game and birds as well. So potentially we could think about whether or not, although we don't have clear evidence of that kind of hunting of small prey or birds at Schöningen, there are some other contemporaneous sites where we do see exploitation, whether it's hunting or something else. Ballamore Cave in Spain, for example, where we kind of see this exploitation by the hominins with these alternative species, if we want to call them that. So we discussed in the paper on that, analyzing that throwing stick in detail, we discussed the potential for that being a tool that could have been used by children and adolescents in learning to hunt and engaging in the hunt in maybe different ways before they began to hunt with the larger wooden spears. You can ask me anything about that later. There's a lot to say about Schöningen always. I could do multiple talks about that. So toy weapons and hunting gear in burials. So this is another maybe category where we could think about children being associated with weapons or weapon components. Burials are more complicated, as anybody who engages with the archaeological records would know, because we don't always know that what someone's buried with was, first of all, you need a really good, clear association to be sure that they were buried with that object. But we can also be sure that those aren't kind of more symbolic or social functions around objects that get associated to that individual, whether or not that means that was their piece of kit or, it's complicated. But so these are kind of some of the questions, and as I'll show you, one of the studies that I thought was very nice looked at the association of projectile points in the Americas with burials, and there are infants who are buried with projectile points. So, clearly the infants aren't hunting. So, however, maybe we can think about that association in other ways. So one of the things I tried to do in the paper, there's not much evidence from what I could see from the review and from April's book as well, associating weaponry with burials. And in this case, it was mainly basically archaeologically, it was spears and spear throwers where we could see archaeological evidence, but much less that I could see in terms of association of bow and arrow technology. That's kind of a different pattern in a way, particularly in infancy, to what we see ethnographically, where we see more association with infancy and bow and arrow technologies. But there are some nice examples, and I'll touch on a couple of them. So this is actually, this was a very nice paper published by Randall House and colleagues a few years ago, exploring a couple of burials at this Peruvian site, one of which was a female burial. It made the news, you might have seen it at the time, because they found this female, they reckoned she was about 19, so I've included her in this talk, because she was a teenager, and we think of her as an adult, but in our kind of exploration, thinking about adolescence is a long period of time, and whether or not she was considered an adult by her community is something that can be a little bit challenging to know. But I think, you know, in a biological sense, we could think that this person is still becoming an adult, at least biologically. So she, and very intriguingly, she had this kind of a whole kit associated with her in the burial very clearly, including these projectile points that are associated with spear throwing, with hunting big game. So this made the news. We could talk about gender at the end, or this kind of suggesting that in the Americas, at least in the time periods, there is actually a very strong association between projectile points and female burials. So they did a really nice review of the archaeological evidence of burials and the association with hunting tools. And basically the statistical probability looked like it was unlikely that this was a kind of chance association, and that we can think about the record, archaeological record, as pointing to females engaging in big game hunting. As I mentioned back here, what's interesting here is that as part of that review, they look and see these associations with the projectile points in infancy. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of maybe sociocultural association without it being children actually learning to hunt yet. So Sungir in Russia is another really interesting archaeological site dating to mid-upper Paleolithic. And I'll focus here on these two sub-adults, which have been the subject of lots of different publications, and most recently by Mary Lewis et al. And colleagues. Mary is in my department at Reading. And so we have two males buried together in this particular burial at the site. The male on your left was about 14 years old at death, and the male on the right was about 11 years old at death. And so Mary and April and colleagues just aged these skeletons as best they could within a framework that Mary's developed. So what's interesting for me about this is that they have 16 mammoth ivory spears associated to this double burial. And these vary in length from very short, 27 centimeters, which to my mind is not a spear, but another type of weapon, possibly a throwing stick. But I haven't found very good analyses of the weapons themselves from these burials, to 2.47 meters, which is the sort of similar length to the Schoningen spears. And most of those ivory spears appear to be associated with the younger boy, but the longest one seems to be associated with the older boy, as well as those to the grave goods. And there are some sort of pathological abnormalities, including sort of bowing of the legs of one of the boys, which Trinkhaus, I think, explored as being potentially signifying difficulties with engaging in hunting, but also mentions that there are high levels of activity on the skeleton, suggesting that potentially they were actually quite engaged, physically engaged, and maybe they were already hunting. at this stage. And what I thought, so one of the other interesting things about the spears is these aren't, although these could be symbolic in terms of the burial, broken bits of similar mammoth ivory spears are found at the site, suggesting that these were definitely hunting tools that the community were using, but just for some reason they're associated in the burial. And there's actually an extraordinary, if you think about it, 16 mammoth ivory spears is a huge thing. That's a huge investment in time to make something like that and to put into that burial. So Michelle Langley has done some brilliant work, I think, on archaeology of childhood and weaponry in particular. So Michelle herself started with kind of osseous projectile studies, particularly upper Paleolithic osseous projectiles. And she's done a couple of really nice papers looking at whether or not we might see kind of repurposing of broken and used weapon components. So looking at these kinds of osseous projectile points from these French sites from Isteritz and Ravache. So she sees these kinds of, some of them are perforated, and then some of the perforations are really badly done, and other perforations are really beautifully done. So she discusses the kind of the possibility that the kids themselves might be doing some of the perforating because it's not very perfectly done. And then you see kind of these kinds of broken projectile points that do indicate they kind of reworking them, just like we see at Schoningen, recycling of the broken weapon points. And some of them are really nicely recycled and repaired, and some of them are really badly done. So she kind of explores the idea again that kids are kind of learning the materials, learning the objects, and engaging with the materials that in that way. So another area that may be a little bit more challenging to think about archaeologically, and art is obviously hugely debated, the purpose of art, but there's some really nice work done on the potential for art serving as functioning as visual props for storytelling. So April herself has done some very nice papers recently exploring that. And then there's other kind of connected theories around whether or not art might have functioned for as sort of holding ethological information about animals. So I'll just very briefly mention some of those ideas. And also the studies that have shown in the recent years that children are present in caves, they are engaging with cave art, and so Jessica Cooney-Williams has published quite a bit on finger flutings and looking at the sizes of finger flutings and showing that kids were probably engaging in parietal art. Handprints as well of infants, as well as children and adolescents in caves, footprints, and other ways of seeing kids in these cave contexts. I think shows us that they're engaging with the art and part of what they call communities of practice. So kids are there exploring, seeing, and probably being brought into this community and learning about there's a potential that these are kind of learning resources for kids, learning about hunting, learning about animal pelts. So this is something that Dale Guthrie explored already back in 2005 in a book on cave art. And there are some issues, I think, with Dale Guthrie's interpretations, particularly around gender, that a lot of people's work has in subsequent years have shown that girls and women are part of cave art and part of caves and inhabiting caves, making the art. But the actual core of the concept, which is that these maybe not Ice Age blackboards, as I say in the paper, but something a little bit more kind of less didactic and a little bit more kind of a community learning environment. that we might still be seeing that the kids here, I love this because I picked this out because you can see that the finger cleavings are crossing over these kinds of engravings, depictions of animals in the cave walls. So you can see that direct engagement of kids with the animals, depictions of animals. And again, back to Michelle Langley's work, within that context of thinking about kids and material culture, she also explored mobiliary art and the potential for either the fact that figurines, which we often think of as symbolic, could they have been kids' toys rather than symbolic objects, and or could some of the broken or discarded adult figurines been engaged with then by children in a sort of second phase of use. So she talks about sort of the polish and with a lot of handling of some of these objects and the fact that they're broken. What I think is also worth pointing out is that some of these figurines are not just about prey animals, but they're about dangerous animals in the environment. So cave lion and bears, animals that kids and adolescents would have needed to know quite a lot about in order to stay safe. So it's important to think about weapons, not just as a hunting tool, but they're a really important tool for self-defense as well. And she looks at she looks at the kind of footprints around these sculptures of bison in the there, and there's Rondell from the Ridas. So this is all Upper Paleolithic material culture. And I think, you know, she makes a really strong case for the consideration of children in terms of engagement with animals as depicted by adults in the community. And what about the human fossil records? So we move away from art and ethnology, which is the study of tracks and footprints. So I was quite light touch on this in my paper, I will confess. I didn't get into great detail, but some of the questions we might ask and do ask archaeologically are around things like whether or not we can see trauma patterns to help us think about age and gender with respect to hunting. So there's been quite a long history of thinking about trauma, whether those trauma patterns actually indicate much of anything in terms of Neanderthal versus Homo sapiens, and also age and gender. And also, how do we interpret the presence of sub-adult footprints at hunting sites? I'm kind of slightly grouping the fossil record and the tracks here, but with the fossil record as well, how might have pathologies interfered with children and adolescent hunting activities? I already touched on that with stone gear. And at what age, sorry, I'll just go back. All right. And at what age might have kids actively hunted in peer groups, and when would they have learned to hunt alongside adults? So that I mentioned that on this slide because there's a physiological component to kids growing up and being able to actually handle a given technology. So think about bow and arrow technology. There's a lot of fine motor control, but it's a much, it depends on the bow and arrow, but you can have quite small scale bow and arrow technologies with spheres. You might need a certain height and physiology before you can handle an adult sized tool. What am I doing wrong here? Sorry. Okay. So in terms of patterning and trauma, I won't get into in great detail. Trinkas did some interesting studies back in the 1990s and argued that there were kind of different trauma patterns between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and suggesting that Neanderthals were experiencing particularly high levels of trauma that suggested that they were kind of a lack of projectile technology, a lack of the ability to hunt at distance. He kind of walked that back later. And here's a more recent study by Bayer and colleagues, which actually found there to be not much difference in the trauma patterns between Neanderthal and Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens, so that you don't kind of see a significant difference in terms of the predicted trauma prevalence. But what I thought was interesting from thinking about learning to hunt is that they did seem to find a difference between age and gender, gender is, apologies, gender is Jenny Francis next studying Gravettian, but they found the difference in the trauma patterns where you had Neanderthals maybe engaging in hunting at a younger age, and the Upper Paleolithic, in contrast, Upper Paleolithic humans were experiencing trauma more in adult phases. And from a pathological perspective, there are some kind of indications that potentially pathology could impact children's ability to learn and be engaging in hunting in a sort of, in contrast with what might be a kind of normal life history pattern. And this was something that was discussed very briefly in Mary Lewis's paper that I just mentioned, looking at Upper Paleolithic, European Upper Paleolithic adolescents, when they looked at Romito 2, who had a skeletal dysplasia, and this was suggested by Tilly, that could have limited his engagement in these Upper Paleolithic hunting activities. So potentially there's something around there that pathology might have gotten in the way in some cases of learning how to hunt. And then finally, in another study, thinking about these demographics of death, this paper by Jenny French and April Noel looked at Gravettian burials and found that although 71% of the adult burials are male, only 59% of the adolescent burials are male, and they kind of engage in the potential in this paper that there was therefore a greater engagement by the adult males in the big game hunting that was a risky kind of activity leading to death, and that there was maybe some a kind of a limit or a limit on the adolescent engagement with big game hunting until they had that maybe the physiology and the skill to do the most dangerous type of hunting. Okay, so on to the footprints. This is actually something that I didn't engage with much in my paper, much to my annoyance after it was published. But there's a fantastic site, White Sands National Monument, New Mexico. And I haven't got a huge amount of time, so I'm going to rush through it, unfortunately. But they look at the kind of the demographics of the tracks and footprints of this, and the engagement between the human footprints and footprints of this giant sloth. And there are these really interesting examples where you have sloth plus human tracks. And they very, very briefly mentioned in there the potential that those footprints were an adolescent who was kind of, tracking and stepping in the footprints of this giant sloth. So I think that's really, and you can see here also they've done a kind of a guess at kind of the age bracketing of the footprints in general at the site, not just the ones associated to the giant sloth. So I think there's some interest there in terms of human footprints. I'm taking you back to Schoningen now, a long way back again to 300,000 years ago, where Altamira and colleagues published year before last a whole host of different footprints at this Paleo Lake, including 3 possible hominin footprints. And they surmised that 2 of the 3 footprints were probably juveniles, but they found the interpretation that these juveniles might have been engaged in the hunting problematic. partly because of how we think about hunting in the Pleistocene. We think of it as an adult activity. We think of it as a male activity. So for me, this was a little bit like, oh, well, you know, why might these hominin footprints of juveniles not be engaging in hunting in some way at the site? Of course, they might have been foraging as well. But I think that there's some potential there to explore, not just when you see children and juveniles in settings to kind of leap to an assumption that they're there with a community group and being protected, but also potentially learning how to hunt and learning how to forage. Okay, so in the second half of the paper, I explore how maybe ethnography can help us to fill in a lot of the gaps that we have archaeologically. So we have challenges, which I'm sure you could see from the archaeological record, sparse evidence, how do we interpret the evidence? So I kind of did a little bit of a review of reviews of this subject, and there's some really fantastic review papers out there. Particularly, I relied particularly heavily on Catherine McDonald's review, which is really fantastic paper. Camp and Whitaker's chapter in Ages and Abilities book was also really interesting. But I do think there were some kind of newer findings that were warranted some exploration as well. So back to Michelle Langley again, who explores in a different paper with Lister, how kind of miniature weapons ethnographically feature a lot in the material culture of children. And they also look at how there are kind of child-specific weapons, which I thought was really interesting. And a good point. Kids have different kinds of weapons, and we see that with the Bayaka as well. The kids have reed spears that they're not hunting with large iron-tipped spears. They're hunting with a child-specific type of weapon. And you might be learning the skills you need to learn with those weapons, but they're kind of different types of things than the adults are using to hunt. In this other review, which was a different sort of review paper, Felix Rita and colleagues looked at 54 different foraging communities with records of children's object use and play. And they found that weapons were actually the most frequent object that have been reported in terms of children's material culture, ethnographically. And then when they do mention gender, when these studies do mention gender, the weapons do appear to be exclusively, they say in this paper, exclusively used by boys. So I tried to kind of think about what we see ethnographically. That's quite a small print, but it is in the paper, where we might start to kind of see patterning in terms of these ages and stages and ethnographic associations with material culture of the weapons themselves. So there's a slight difference, I think, with spears and bow and arrows, as I mentioned already, which is that in infancy, I didn't see any examples of association of infants and spears, whereas you do have some examples ethnographically where kids might be given, infants might be given bow and arrows as a gift in infancy, as a sort of a charm. So this might start to receive these kinds of gifts in infancy. And I didn't see anything like that with spears. Weirdly, I saw very little about spear throwers ethnographically. So whilst I see spears and spear throwers archaeologically, there wasn't very much about spear throwers and children ethnographically. So we have this kind of difference here that I think would be interesting to try and fill in that gap. And then in early childhood, ethnographically, we see kids starting to do role playing. They'll spear things like invertebrates first. We see this with the Bayaka, they'll hunt butterflies and grasshoppers with their spears first. Target-oriented games and starting to accompany older children on peer hunting groups. And similarly with bow and arrows, so things like hunting small game like birds and lizards. Then in middle childhood, they start to, kids with spears start to more actively engage in the spear hunting. Initially hunting small game, they'll use traps to hunt birds. but also without traps. So the Bayaka kids will hunt rats and locate the rat nest and hunt the rats using their spears. And then the spear throwing and handling practice begins with using these kinds of simplified wooden spears and sticks. With bow and arrows, we see kids in middle childhood starting to hunt larger game using either smaller sized bow and arrows or even adult sized bows, and they start to hunt alone. So I thought that was an interesting difference between bow and arrow and spear use, whereas the spears seem to be kind of more a group, communal peer group hunting activity. The bow and arrows, the kids can kind of go off on their own or in smaller groups, and they start to hunt larger animals. So maybe bow and arrows are a technology that kind of support earlier engagement with hunting, which is interesting because that's definitely not a technology that's associated with pre-Homo sapiens. And then in adolescence with spear use, we see spear throwing, javelin throwing. With young adolescents, they start with lighter javelins. So this is a particularly nice study, I think, Dira and Hewlett, and also Sala and colleagues looking at chabu hunting. And so they will start to hunt small game like Dowker. And then the older adolescents start to hunt medium-sized game. And they use the Bayaka adolescents, for example, they'll use the same spears that the adults use. And so they're using those same materials and same types of weapons once they reach adolescence. And with bow and arrow technologies, the adolescents seem to start to hunt more challenging prey in this age, and using more dangerous technologies like poisons and barbs. There's a lot of nice, I think, new studies that have started to look at the process of teaching and learning as well. And my colleague, Shana Levy, and I worked together on quite a lot of different types of studies, specific things around the Bayaka and how they learn to hunt. We've done some experiments, which I'm still working on analyzing the video footage of, but we will publish that hopefully this year. And what we kind of can say as an overview is that learning of hunting skills does start in infancy, and it seems to progress through childhood and adolescence, as I mentioned in that table that I've just gone through in detail. And that social learning, including in peer groups, is really, really important for learning to hunt, at least with spears. And that social learning tends to occur before the more like individual one-to-one teaching that happens with the adults. And kids seem to acquire their skills in lots of different ways, through observation, through their peer group play, their hunting forays, and games that are oriented specifically around learning to throw and hit targets. And that was really important to me to think about that in terms of what I mentioned at the very beginning, that development of skill and the importance of developing those skills physically early enough in childhood that you have that. And so you might not have the body strength yet, but you start already to kind of have this engagement between brain and body, the weapon, the tool, and the object of the object of your kill eventually. And contrary to the narratives that kids aren't really taught actively in forager societies, one of the really important findings in this paper, led by Shana, which was part of that study we did of Bayaka learning how to hunt, is that actually with spear hunting and with hunting possibly in general, which is thought to be a particularly complex skill, there actually was quite a lot of direct teaching going on. And there was a lot of language that was going on as part of that teaching. And the teaching involves, so we have all, hours and hours and hours of video footage of these hunting forays. And we see demonstration and practice going on in these hunting forays, these teaching forays between the adolescent and the adult. So they go out in a pair, and they'll learn to hunt with the spear in this way. And there's lots of this bit of teasing going on, that sort of thing as well. But there's definitely direct teaching and instruction and an involvement of language in that teaching. So that's something that I thought was a particularly interesting thing that came out of that specific study, because it kind of goes against the narrative that there isn't teaching. Yes. What I think we still don't understand so much is that kind of relationships between experience and body size, strength and age, and how those might relate to the specifics of weapon scaling, weapon type, but also the type of prey that you might be hunting in the environment. So these are kinds of things that are as a part of some of the research that I'm trying to do now. That's just a very quick slide of some of the images from those studies around the spear throwing study that we've done. I'll give you a little spoiler alert, which is that the Bayaka are much better at hitting a target than my javelin athletes were when I had them starting in spears. So that's probably not just the spears, because these are also heavy and long spears, but their skill that they've developed over many years. And being embedded within a community of practice. So back to that concept of the art making, also weaponry and hunting, I think could also be something we think of as a community of practice. Danger. I'm nearly done. So this is a one to kind of make sure that we talk about a little bit. I know you want me to talk about gender, and I will at the end. But I think, you know, this is really interesting to me. So there was just a paper that a colleague who's done some really nice studies around flint napping, and you know, there's quite a lot of studies around flint napping and whether or not we can see material culture of childhood and learning how to flint nap. So I haven't talked about that at all today, because that's not hunting specifically. Might be learning how to make hunting gear, but flint napping is all kinds of other tasks as well. And this colleague sent this paper around to myself and to Shayna and some other archaeologists, saying, you know, looked at this particular assemblage, and here's our paper. This might be kids in these kinds of small projectile points. And, you know, Shayna sort of sent me a private email, because some of the replies by the archaeologists were, shall we say, not particularly polite, but very dismissive of the idea that kids might ever be engaging in anything that might be dangerous. So as in a sharp object. And so to the anthropologists in the room, this would sound ridiculous, because of course that's a very Western idea that kids, that people worry about kids and sharp objects. Lancey's done some nice work on this, hasn't he? There's a great that famous picture of the child with the machete. So there, what I found in the review backs up that, you know, Lancey's work and other people's work, which is that they're not that concerned about the objects, right? The things that they're concerned about with their kids and learning to hunt and going out on hunting forays are things like snakes, predators, getting lost, not having access to water, weather conditions, stuff like that. Those are the things that they're concerned about in terms of scaffolding the hunting and learning how to hunt. They're not so concerned about the material culture itself. And one of the other interesting things I thought was around this danger was that the environment itself probably has an effect on the age at which children in a given society are kind of allowed to join adult hunting expeditions. And that's particularly the case for large game hunting. And then those kinds of risky scenarios, and I think it's McDonald talks about this in particular in her paper, risky scenarios may be mitigated then more in a risky environment through things like object and role playing near the camp. These are some of my kind of questions now. This is data that's just coming out of the field, sort of getting texted to me in little piecemeal notes that I'm going to need to translate, which is kind of trying to understand better who makes kids tools, who makes kids hunting weapons. Do they make them themselves? Are they different? This seems to vary cross-culturally. It's not very well documented, but weapons do have often significant organic components, so we wouldn't necessarily see it archaeologically, which is where I think the ethnographic record can help us think about that kind of organic component. Are kids' weapons more ephemeral than adult weapons? Possibly. But we do see again that they do use both toy weapons and they use these functional weapons. So how can we tell archaeologically what the difference is? I think that might be a challenge, not necessarily an insurmountable archaeological challenge, because there are things we can do with things like use wear and macrofracture analysis of these potential kids tools. But yeah, so they are often different, not just in scale, but also design material. I've run out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up real quick, which is to say that kids do, they focus on different prey animals a lot of the time. So they, as I mentioned in the earlier slides, so here are some examples of some of the animals that they might be learning to hunt with. They don't start with hunting the large game. And here's the promised ending, which is this kind of the complex relationship between thinking about, there've been a lot of debates in the last couple of years with various papers and analyses of the ethnographic data around female hunting in the ethnographic record. So what I found in looking at the review papers and engaging with this in terms of children, which is that it does vary cross-culturally, as we know, the engagement of hunting by men and women, and also with girls and boys. There is that strong association between boys and toy weapons, as I mentioned in Rita and colleagues' review. But girls play at hunting, they do play at hunting, and they do hunt in peer groups and with adults in some communities. And so in one of Shayna's review papers comparing Bayaka and Hadza, it does show that although boys will engage in hunting play more than girls, the girls play at hunting more than the boys will play at house. And I thought, they don't actually talk about that in the paper, but I thought that was really, when I looked at the results in that table, I thought that was interesting, that there is a sexual division of play that mimics what is happening in the adult sphere, but maybe girls kind of cross into that boundary of hunting more than we think they might be doing even in those communities. And as I mentioned, I think we still have a poor understanding of both women and girls hunting and the associated material culture with that. But I stand corrected if I think you mentioned some good papers on that already. So I will leave it there and invite the debate, but I just, thank you very much for inviting me. And also I just mentioned a few of my colleagues who helped me with this paper in particular.
Great. Thank you so much for a fantastic review of all the areas.
Thank you.
Education. Yeah, you have a question? Yeah.
Just the point about girls had boys hunting. Sorry, I mean, yes, I had to mention there of boys don't play house, but girls play hunting. I mean, the difficult point to me seems to be that hunter-gatherer, immediate return hunter-gatherers are always bride service. They don't have they're bride service society. So boys don't get married.
Yeah.
They don't have conjugal right to a woman.
Okay.
You've got to earn those. You've got to earn their sexual access.
Okay.
By providing meat. But that doesn't work unless the girl plus her mother can say no at any time. And then you have the idea of divorce is really there. Guys being useless or lazy, that's it. No sex. And that in turn means that women can motivate the guys by, controlling access to sex. And then, of course, you have the fact that that's regarded as management of the hunting, because it is. So what I'm saying is that girls are always, as they grow up, I mean, they're preparing to hunt. And then in adulthood, they'll be really hunting because they're managing, they're motivated.
Which you mentioned a bit before I gave the talk, which I think is a really interesting point about that management of the hunt, something that I really hadn't kind of considered
We'll
before.
never find any
Yeah.
hunting going on without some kind of hunting magic.
Yeah,
And the hunting magic is all about sex.
yeah,
And essentially it's about not having sex before the hunt.
yeah,
And then if the hunt fails, especially, I mean, Mary Douglas was telling me all about this. If the guys go hunt an elephant or something, and suddenly the elephant kills the hunters, well, who's been having sex? And they blame the women
yeah,
for not being strong enough on the sofa. Then, of course, in addition to that, we have all the symbolic stuff, which is with a hunter, for example, a girl when she menstruates, she's shot her first zebra. I mean, they shot her.
Yeah.
And again, Jerome talked about all that. So there's all these symbolic things that make it not that surprising to find that it's symbolically in burials,
yeah,
women are related to the hunt. And then we think of all the mythology, Diana the huntress and all these things. It doesn't mean they necessarily, you wouldn't find this in the archaeology, because it doesn't mean they're
Well,
physically
yeah.
doing the hunting.
That's the problem.
But managing the hunt.
Yeah.
It's like normal with hunting.
Yeah.
hunters.
So I think that's a really nice example of where the ethnographic record can help us sort of start to not definitively interpret the archaeological record in the deep past, but help us to consider the things that might not leave a material culture signature for taphonomic reasons, or because they just don't have a material culture element that we're going to see archaeologically. And I think the thing that I had a little bit more of a discussion about it in the paper initially, and quite rightly, one of the reviewers sort of pointed out that it's a much bigger discussion that's had a lot of engagement already. So I took it out, but I do end the paper by having a think about where the ethnographic record, where we need to be careful, and not say that just because we don't see something ethnographically doesn't mean that in the deep past, it's over vast swathes of time, and especially when we're talking about pre-Homo sapiens, other things could absolutely have been occurring. And so it's not for me that the ethnographic record tells us what happened in the past, but it helps us to kind of reevaluate and explore these kinds of alternative and invisible aspects. And in fact, that was the theme really of the collection of papers on children and childhood that April edited, was around that kind of the invisibility, the sort of secret lives of children. What are we not seeing archaeologically?
I think it's absolutely wonderful to have the emphasis on that stage, those processes of learning, particularly looking at spears, looking at the bows and arrows. I've watched that with the boys with the Hadza. To see that. And of course, what happens for the Hadza, I mean, the definition of adulthood for a boy or going into initiation with the Hadza is epenet, is killing an epenet animal.
Okay.
That with being able to, with the great big Hadza bows, which is an unusual sort of power bows, that they can kill an animal in that category.
Right.
And that means he gets the chance to marry, if you don't call it, and bride service for the girl of his choice, or whoever he can get with him. But it's also worth mentioning, adding to what Chris is saying, the famous examples with the Kalahari groups, where a girl in her menstrual part, one of her acts is that she takes a bow and arrow to shoot a mask of hensball, and that is meant to be the only time she touches a bow with poison arrow.
Poison, but
I mean, it has the implication of the taboos between menstrual blood and arrow poison, which are very much found with the Hadza as well, which suggests they've got antiquity into manufacture of arrow poison. So that is a typical example of a symbolic, which then gives great luck to those bows and arrows. But she's not going to touch any poison arrows anywhere it will go near them again. And yet the classic example, which Jerome tells us of Yele, where the women are, this is the great elephant hunt, where the women are going into trance and singing in trance, and have this kind of across the forest vision of where is the elephant, and then they tell the men that's where to find the elephant, go and get it.
Oh, wow.
That's called a women's hunt.
Women's hunt.
A women's hunt.
It's
Okay.
organised and
That's
it's brought
interesting.
back.
Yeah.
To
Obviously,
tell the whole process.
Yes.
in time.
they generate it.
Yeah.
And it's real, it really works.
I don't know, according to Jerome, it works. I don't know what Dasher thinks, but yeah.
Can I just pull up the topic of something more intangible? And I think it's what pops up occasionally in what you're presenting, but it's the concept of teamwork.
Yeah.
When you showed the picture of the double burial.
Yeah.
The thing I thought about was it looked like to me like a set of golf clubs. And that which might be a bit of a leap. But that
Golf clubs, did you say?
golf clubs, yeah. I mean,
The best for it.
that you have a whole variety of different weapons. You knock a ball around a bit of green.
Yeah.
And but also that when wolves start hunting, they go out in a structured pack. They don't just go out as a mob. The pack is sort of structured.
Yeah.
Sort of ones leading the way, and you keep the younger ones near the back so they don't screw things up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that also applies to humans. You don't want your kids running around lobbing spears every time they see someone. So my guess would be that well, you may be able to tell me this, that in hunting groups when they go out, they use the younger males, basically as spear carriers. So you have
Oh, yeah.
skilled ones who are going out and being like your,
Yeah.
I've got the name of the group, who are really super accurate at throwing.
They
Have
are.
them to the front, you have
Yes,
the young
yes,
one,
yeah.
like part of the stick, send me another one, send me another
Yeah.
one.
So that's a really interesting idea, actually, and I think the classic interpretation of Pleistocene hunting with spears is that it's a communal group activity. I think it's important to mention that ethnographically, it's a little more complicated than that, and it's very environmentally and prey specific. So if you are hunting specific types of prey for whom a group hunting and the environment itself, that works. So the interpretation around hunting at Schoningen, for example, is that you have a group of adult males. And some people would say only thrusting. I didn't get into this at all today. And others like myself think that at least some of the spears were designed in such a way as to enable a kind of a different sorts of hunting strategies, so distance as well as contact. And I think that what you're suggesting in terms of thinking about age and maybe stages of where you might be within a group hunting context, if you are hunting with spears in a group, might not always be the case. But if you are, that the younger, or that might be kind of a graduated engagement in terms of location, but also maybe the particular object. So I kind of hinted at that a bit with the very speculative idea that some of these smaller weapons at Schoningen could have been adolescent or maybe even middle childhood tools, where they're engaging and observing the hunt. This doesn't show kids, but one of Clarice's other images of reconstructing the hunting environment. So you can see here they're hunting birds, but there's also a depiction of a woman hunting with the throwing sticks, not with the spears, but with the throwing sticks. And I think, the possibility that they're there in the environment in a community sense, hence the connection with the footprints, and kind of not just back in a kind of home camp type area, but actually here at the activity site. And there's a very nice painting as part of a book for the public, which is published on the site, which is published in German, which depicts the lake. It depicts women throwing the spears at the horses, and an old man teaching the children how to make them, which I thought was a kind of, at least it's
It's all well.
It might not be all wrong. You don't, it's 300,000 years ago. We don't know. But I think what was good about that was the engagement of the children with the manufacturing phase of the tools, and the fact that they're present in that activity site. As we can see with the footprints and potentially with the weapons. It's huge. It is speculative to think about childhood in through the weapon scaling itself. But I think it's, you know, you say it might be wrong, but we don't know that about gender and hunting in the deep past. We don't know that. We just don't, we can't know that about, you know.
Well,
At the moment, from an archaeological perspective, we can't know.
And certainly if you're talking about
Yes.
very low extent.
Yes, if I'm going to be radical here in the radical archaeology talk, I'm going to say that just because you see that in amongst contemporary hunter-gatherers doesn't mean that women aren't engaging in big game hunting in the past. We don't know that. Yes.
We think Cara,
Yes.
Ockenbach and Lacey have the onus of proof on them to say, oh, the gender division of labour started 9,000 years ago. It's a little bit tough. That.
I mean, Leslie, yeah, you had a few things to say about that.
Well, yeah, in terms of female energetics and reproductive energetics, there are, you know, difficulties with
Why would you with it, you know?
There's also what Helga Virit for the Kua of the Eastern Kalahari, you know, the women's attitude, you know, hunting's boring, let men do it. They want to be social on their foraging trips. They don't want to be creeping around in the difficult bush.
Fair enough, but but focusing back on kids.
Yeah, no,
I do like the idea that you have a kind of community of practice and learning and engagement of children and adolescents within the environment, and within, you know, not necessarily, as you pointed out, doing that direct, you know, the direct spearing of the large animals. Until they have maybe the physiology, you know, the physiological capability, as well as the, you know, that you don't want to risk children's lives in too young
kind of. I would say that the most important thing, if you're hunting big game, as in all agonistic encounters, is to know when to walk away.
Yeah.
And that's
comments.
if you don't come back,
Yes.
you don't get to come back.
Yeah.
And
We've got comments, we've got,
As Ian said,
I would think
No,
also
Alistair.
game
and then
That's
Charles asked, do you have any ideas on the evolution of childhood?
Yeah.
where you see the
who's
people-
Charles?
people on
Which
that
Charles? Just Charles?
swirling down
Yeah.
It might be our Charles.
And then going
Shall we
a short shot.
put a gallery
Yeah.
at the end so we can see now?
Yeah.
Is
Great,
any
thank you.
is
This was
Eleanor
something
or
on point.
Ian there?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
just,
I don't know, we can't.
Does anybody online want to question?
So Charles asked, do you have any ideas?
Charles, do you want to speak?
I did ask them to
Oh, right,
put
okay.
if they want to say it out loud,
Right.
but
Sorry, I've been muted,
Oh.
but
There we
I'll put the video
Great.
on.
We
Yeah.
can't see you except us.
No. It's just something I'm interested in. I know it's not easy, but if look at the Nariokotomi boy, for example. I mean, he's almost adult at the age of 12, I believe. So not much in the way of childhood Zen, which is sort of early Homo erectus, I think, or I can't think of the other species name.
Erectus or Augusta.
Yeah, Augusta is sometimes called that.
But so the question is the
Yeah.
evolution of a childhood or adolescence.
Yeah.
and how
seeing as the
recent
fossil
that
evidence
is.
is thin.
I mean, there are, so I would recommend you to April Noel's book on that, and
Right,
who is has a nice kind of review of the paleontological record and childhood. My short answer, apart from that's not my expertise, is that my understanding is at the moment that the question of the emergence of the longer extended childhood is at the forefront now of what we want to try and understand. And one of the difficulties with that is just the paucity of the fossil record, particularly with children's remains not preserving as well due to bone mineral density and potentially differential later differential treatment of the bodies.
What was the surname of the book? Growing Up in the Ice Age, right?
Growing Up in the Ice Age,
April,
Fossil and Archaeological Evidence.
Okay.
That's April Noel's book, yeah.
Thank you.
And so she goes over the fossil evidence and those questions around the emergence of the different stages of childhood very well. Yes.
Children and play and experimentation,
Yeah.
and how much, because children love messing around with technology, and if they see, there's snapping, we've seen the technology. So I'm just thinking, how much would they, through their efforts to learn, how would they be developing it? And it's more just a thought, really.
There's some really, and I don't have them particularly on this PowerPoint, but there's some really nice kinds of papers looking at the importance of play in childhood. So in terms of archaeologically, Felix Reeves, as well as Michelle Langley and April Noel have all kind of explored that importance of play. So I didn't talk about that so much because I'm kind of focusing on the skill building, but you're right that play is a huge method through which children learn, and also experimentation. So in this paper, for example, led by
doing a lot of this work, isn't she?
she's amazing. She keeps me on my toes, that's for sure. She always has new ideas, and actually she and I met here at UCL because I invited her to give a talk here on children learning subsistence skills when we were both finishing our PhDs. So Shane is at Durham now, about in the psychology department. So this paper here, we explore innovation and play from ethnographic and archaeological evidence. So this is Shana's, I think, next big body of work. She's just won an ERC. And looking at peer group learning, but she's explored, and a lot of other people as well have explored that importance of play and experimentation. It's harder to see that archaeologically, not the play so much, because there's some nice examples of Paleolithic of kids kind of going off and having their kind of secret spaces and their own little huts off out in the view of adults, and maybe playing in caves and things like that away from adults. But we do see a little bit, some potential examples of experimenting going on in flint knapping, but it's really hard with the stuff that I do in terms of play and experimentation, because so much of it wouldn't preserve. And I think this is, one of the problems anyway, when you're looking at organics and woodworking and things like this, it's really hard to know what are kids capable, but yeah, so that play and experimentation, I think, is a really important part of it. And I didn't show videos, but we've got some really nice videos of kids doing kind of target practice and learning how to, they throw their reed spears at, I think it's palm trees, and that they're trying to hit larger things first, but they're also playing at hunting. When they have a butterfly, they're proud of hunting a butterfly. But yeah, no, I think it's absolutely true that play and experimentation would have been an important part of it too. Probably not just for the innovation as well as
Two on that. There's some on Zoom, and then we'll come to Chris. Okay, so 2 on Zoom. We want to.
Okay, Elena Mariki, did you want to speak?
Or Ian? Is it Eleanor or Ian?
Ian, I suppose.
Yeah, just very briefly. You'll be familiar with Marlise Lombard's work on spear tips.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, I didn't mention her work, but she's done a lot around kind of cognition in childhood. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was wondering, what do you think of? I mean, she's putting forward this argument that thrown spears with stone tips seem to be a very late development. She's talking about sort of marine isotope stage 6, so that's sort of from 200,000 or 190 down to 130,000. So
Yes.
that is actually during our speciation, or the latter part of our speciation.
In Africa. Yeah.
Got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, different topic. But I do have thoughts. I have a paper coming out any day now, by my colleague, Dirk Lader, who published on the wooden spears with thinking about the problems associating TCSA, TCSP, and wooden spears, and the origins of throwing, which isn't quite the same as what you're asking about tipping spears with stone points. I definitely have thoughts on it that probably extend beyond my ability to answer it accurately today, but I think I would say that I feel that in Europe there are examples of stone points from earlier in the archaeological record, Biash-Saint-Vaast, for example, 200,000, and then, you know, arguably Katupan in South Africa as early as 500,000, that suggest that actually the emergence of stone-tipped weapons, and then the question of throwing is a different one, but an interrelated one. That 160,000 for my mind is actually quite late, and probably it was earlier than that. That's my perspective on the basis of the evidence as we have it.
Any thoughts on that, Ian? Katupan, there's meant to be.
Well, I think I think the archaeologists at Katu, and these are currently, I think, sort of considered the earliest possible spear points, stone spear points. Their idea was that these were thrusting spears rather than thrown any distance. And in terms of throwing, I think what we're
only because they tested them as thrusting spears and not as throwing spears. So morphologically, morphometrically, there isn't anything that particularly rules those weapon points out as thrown spears, and that's a part of the subject of the paper that Dirk and I are publishing next week. Hopefully, it should be out any day now. Really, is that I don't think that the ethnographic record on morphometrics of weapon points is clear enough to there's too much overlap to be able to distinguish between thrusting and throwing in the archaeological record, and that goes for the wooden spears as well as other spears. But that's a point of divergence and debate for sure. But that's my perspective, is that it's really not that clear, and that therefore that's not pointing to the origins of throwing or versus thrusting. So I think it's a watch this space and we don't know answer. Not that I think that they were throwing at Katupan, but that we can't tell that from the evidence as we have it.
One more at Zoom and then Chris.
So Alistair has a question, and he also just commented on what we were talking about. He said, I've seen a current Australian traditional hunter throwing a hardly worked sharpened branch and hitting and killing a boar at about 30 yards as it ran away from him.
That's a big kill a boar. Wow.
It was on he's a mixed race Australian, a native man who had been in the Australian Army in Vietnam, and he did a series of programs about traditional people's techniques, and he just showed a man killing a boar with basically a branch.
Was it thrown like a spear or like
He you went with no chance, and it just hit him straight in the middle.
Like
a throwing stick, Alistair.
Well, it was what looked like, as I said, an unworked piece of branch, basically, with a sharpened stick with a sharpened end, but it wasn't formed as a spear. It was just basically off a tree. I mean, it was extraordinary, but he was so accurate. And it didn't fly straight. It flew, because it wasn't exactly straight, so it flew. It was extraordinary. But this is, I think that I wonder, what I'm saying is I don't know whether the stone pointing was critical, because you can just get very good at these things when you practice. I mean, you know, people
agree
do.
with that.
Alistair, also, do you want to ask your question, or should I read out what you wrote in the chat?
Oh, about the girls, yes. I in current Homo sapiens, girls typically grow faster than boys until puberty. And is this also the case with H. erectus and earlier? My point being that until the advent of the full FCC suite was established, would the bigger female children have been more likely to be active hunters?
I think I'm going to put a I don't know label on that, but
So
it is a
many
very
questions.
it's
we
a very
don't know.
good question and point, but I don't have the answer to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is quite sort of straightforward and simple, but it's about another obvious, quite big controversy really. I mean, it's about the direct instruction among the binoculars.
Yes.
Experienced hunters directly instructing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Adolescents have experience. I mean, so I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about it. Just about how can there be such a disagreement? Because I mean, as you know, Jerome Lewis is such a point that nobody tells anyone else what to do.
Yeah.
And nobody gives direct instruction. You show rather than tell. How can there be such a difference? I mean, I've seen China's photograph and it looks like
Yeah.
guys were instructed in some way. Is it just about how you define instruction?
So that actually was not instruction. That was an experiment where they're where they're throwing. So I have so the subject of that particular study, the data underpinning it are focal follows, but without an observer there. So the adult and the adolescent wore GoPro videos and went out on their hunting forays. And all of the video footage, hours and hours and hours of all these different video footage was coded for looking for when instruction and teaching is taking place and exactly what form that took. And I think that, the argument we make in this paper is that because spear hunting is a particularly complex skill, that it is scaffolded in a different way to other skills. And so you do have, up until a certain age and stage, much more sort of, that different kinds of learning where you've got observation or storytelling or play, experimentation, peer group learning. Whereas when you then there seems to be this kind of adolescent stage with the Bayaka specifically in the spear hunting, where they're learning and being taught and they're not just being taught where to find the animal, but also, as I mentioned, how to carry the spear, how to throw the spear, how to thrust the spear.
Jerome himself an experienced hunter. I mean, Jerome goes with the hunter. How do
Yeah.
you make sense
Well,
of
you
that?
have to read the paper and let me know what you think
Do you remember
of the
that?
data. So there's some, yes.
How Jerome got it so wrong?
Yeah.
He's been hunting for 70 years.
I don't know if it's getting it wrong so much as the kinds of questions we ask and how and how they're being asked and how the data are collected. So I think because Shana is always her focus and interest has always been in how children learn in forager communities learn subsistence skills. This is what she's done, and I think largely that has been the narrative is that direct teaching and language and instruction is not taking place. But part of that, I think, Michelle Klein has done some interesting work on this as well. Part of that depends on maybe how you think about what we call teaching. And so some of that might be about categorization of what you classify as teaching. But I think it's hard to argue that, hold the spear like this, throw it like this, no, throw it again like that, try that's not teaching. I mean, I think most of us would argue that that's,
But it,
yes.
but
Yeah.
when you had this factor of danger, and when you're getting into situations that are more dangerous, then drawing on this costly tuition or example is quite clearly, it would also be applicable with the Hadza with use of arrow poison and so forth, and anything that's involving large game.
And there might be a difference between spear hunting and bow and arrow hunting, because I think there are differences between these different technologies.
But
and
but
how
in
they're
terms
learned.
of the creation
teaching,
of arrow
yeah.
poison and so
Okay.
forth, it's at a level of kind of risk or
Okay.
needing to have very specific knowledge for that.
There's some
Did you
questions in the
want
back.
questions at the back? No.
Just continuing, so like having public.
Is the what public? Not yet. But I can talk to Shayna about making the videos, whether or not the videos, I think there might be ethics issues around whether or not those videos can be made public. But we can have a conversation. Yes, it's just many hours of work to do that, but yeah, potentially, it isn't, they aren't public now, but they could potentially be anonymized, yeah.
They've only made their field work at a very different time.
Yeah, you mean in contrast with the teaching question, yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's, I don't have it at my fingertip. It's Lingala.
Lingo.
The Bayaka. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm not, it's not my, I don't have it at my fingertips with the specifics of the. It's in the papers, yes.
Yeah, I'm an art student, but I guess I was interested in if you've done any research into like the differences between children growing up in like communities, these like hunting communities,
Yeah.
and how they, you obviously know how they, but like how maybe like a feral child, a child that like grows up surrounded by animals, raised by animals.
Oh. I don't know if that is, do you know examples?
About children growing up in hunting communities compared to
Feral.
feral children.
Oh,
Like,
I've only heard.
there's been like basically
I don't know anything about that, but it sounds very interesting. I mean, what you would be able to do without a community. Without that, is that your question effectively, sort of if you were isolated? Yeah.
human.
No, I don't know anything about that, so,
I had to.
yep,
I guess I was also interested in, like, because we spoke about gender, like how binary the roles are within these different communities, and then also like how women might play into these things, like what I don't know, the gay boys don't whatever do the cost, so like how, and like there was a lot of conversation about like hunting being interactive with like being like sexual
yeah,
and like access to marriage.
yep.
I don't know, maybe like in
I don't know the answer to that either. I feel like I've been asked a lot of questions I don't know the answer to at the end of this talk, but that's because I'm an archaeologist and not an anthropologist. But it is an interesting question, and you know, there probably people who are better placed.
A lot more
to-
research.
I
needs
think
to be
more,
done.
yeah, more research needed, probably space. Yeah.
Okay, with the Hadza, you would have definitely possibility of a person, male gendered, stepping into female roles, wanting to do that. It's accepted to do it, and it's generally an acceptance from hunting gathering, certainly African hunting gathering societies. If people are different or diverse, that's accepted. They don't make a big issue for it.
You might still be able to person to make a choice. I think Jerome would say that, you know, if a man feels he's got to be a woman, but it's, you can't, I mean, it's a binary holes that you probably.
There might be, well, yeah,
It's complex.
it's complex, and also gender ritual is absolutely a demonstration of
playing with being the other sex, playing out being the other sex, happening in gender ritual contexts. That happens with all African people that I know about. So there's a lot of sophistication in the constructions of gender among, you think it's clear-cut sex division of labor, but the rituals play around with that extraordinarily. So we get examples where if women are hunting, it happens in those contexts. Quite extreme.
I think archaeologically speaking, there's certainly been more engagement with, you know, the possibility that
possibility when
there are
actually
differences in terms of gender.
So
A gender binary, should we say, you know, that there's a more, and also sex specific, you know, the idea of sex specific roles around things like warfare and violence as well as hunting. But it's not, it's it's a good question, but I don't have the answer.
Big question. There was a couple of things in it, just observing some of the art and symbolism. The beautiful lion from Istoritz has those arrow motifs that are just the same as shown on the bison. The Istoritz famous, the carved ivory knife with these ones, those arrow motifs in the shoulder and the back and the hind quarter. And it just reminded me so much of the bison, the Istoritz bone, where you get the figure of a woman going after the bison, and she's got these arrows of just the same time in her backside and in the bison's shoulder.
And I think that there's a lot, there's something I didn't really, you know, really talk about as much, but that within the bridal art as well, there's kind of the potential for, you know, the engagement between weaponry and animal. We don't have human depictions very often in Upper Paleolithic art anyway. But, you know, I think that was kind of a large part of the foundation of some of Guthrie's initial ideas around that, was that, you know, there could be some kind of holding of information about a target area, why you need art. You know, why you need art to explain where to hit an animal. If you're
but what's so beautiful about that Istoritz, I mean, it's our argument about a woman's blood is the animal's blood. The Istoritz one shows exactly that, the wound of the animal, the wound of the woman. It's like two things. There was also in the Villa Maya burial context, there was some extraordinarily beautiful ochre in there as well. Which is really
ochre features a lot, and
I mean it does, but it was very extraordinary, remarkable, beautiful in amongst those. Any more? Oh, it's another question, John. We'll wrap up on your question.
It's for a point. The arrow points, or things that look like arrows, they're not killing blows. They're basically aimed to weaken the muscles and basically stop the animal. So that might be a lesson in how to stop the animal, not how to kill it.
That's why they use poison.
In the animal can keep walking, but slower, and then they can follow its blood. You're dripping blood now. And then
you're hopefully die, but it's a very tricky, uncertain thing, which the trick takes on intervening. Are we going on more grilling? I think Annemieke has done very beautifully here. We're looking at like leading edge of so much of this research, your own and Shayna's and Mary Lewis and all.
But actually, I didn't talk in great detail about our research because I wanted to give the overview. But I think part of, you know, the research from Shayna, with Shayna and myself, and other bits that we've tried to put together have been to try and underpin some of the interpretations of weaponry with some more data.
Is your HDR paper accessible on ResearchGate or anywhere? Because HDR is notably inaccessible to a lot of people.
It is on the Reading website as an accepted manuscript version.
Yes, that's
but
what
it's not
happens.
ideal.
No, I know
yeah.
it's not ideal.
Um,
But if people wrote to you, you
yes.
might be understanding. what
Because
you
I think the restrictions were.
No, but if people emailed you personally, you could.
Oh,
send
oh,
them
for
a
sure.
PDF
Oh, yeah, for
and
sure.
get-
Yeah.
if you
No, I could
wanted
definitely do
to
that.
get The PDF for
Yes.
that lovely paper, it's not so easy to get from HBR if they're
No.
not signed up for it, so I'll
Thank
send
you.
her. So wonderful, thank
Oh,
you
thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you
for
very
your
much.
input. I'm just gonna say goodbye to the Zoom people and tell Zoom, about next week and other people here about next week. We're hearing from Paulina Michnowska, who's a kind of artist anthropologist who's been working in Borneo. So it's notes from the forest and storytelling with the Penan, and she's going to be talking about collaborations with Penan hunter-gatherers in Borneo in their their attempts to support to save and preserve environment and preserve culture, of course. So that should be a very interesting talk, and I hope they'll be coming back next week for more on that. And goodbye to people on Zoom, and thank you very much for your questions, and everybody's coming. Hope you can return next week. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's so lovely to have you.
Thank you.
And we are going to go to this, you're going to come to the
Yeah, I'll
pub,
come to
so
the pub.
more
Yeah,
questions
come
from
to the
Mick
pub.
in the pub. And some of us will definitely go there. So last week, a couple of people turned up and but we will probably all be there next week. Now, we want to make sure we keep everybody's here. Don't forget any